The first thing I knew was the scent of old books and lemon oil. It was a clean, settled smell, the kind that belongs to a place where things are cared for over a long time. My cheek was pressed against the rough, woven texture of a sofa cushion, and a thick wool blanket, heavy as a winter coat, was tucked around my shoulders. I didn't remember pulling it there. I didn't remember much of anything, except the bone-deep chill that had seeped into me hours before, a cold that felt less like temperature and more like a final state of being. A low fire crackled somewhere to my left, its soft popping sounds the only disturbance in a profound and unfamiliar quiet. My eyes opened slowly, gritty and sore. The light was gentle, filtered through tall, mullioned windows that looked out onto a world blanketed in deep, untouched snow. A man was sitting in a leather armchair by the fire, a book resting open in his lap. He wasn't reading. He was just looking into the flames, his profile etched by the flickering light. Arthur Vance. I knew his name the way everyone in the small town of Northwood knew it. He was a quiet pillar of the community, a man who had made his fortune somewhere else and come back here to live in the old stone house on the hill, the one that overlooked the entire valley. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with silver at his temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of thought, not laughter. He must have sensed me stirring, because his head turned. His eyes, a clear, calm gray, met mine. There was no surprise in them, just a quiet assessment. He didn't smile, not exactly, but the severity of his expression softened. "You're awake," he said. His voice was low and even, a gravelly baritone that seemed to match the sturdy, reliable presence of the room. It was the same voice I'd heard once before, a year ago, when he'd come into the library where I worked part-time and asked for a book on restoring antique clocks. I'd fumbled the search, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard, flustered by his patient stillness. I tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over me. The blanket slid away, and I realized I was still in my damp jeans and worn sweater. "Where?" My own voice was a croak. "My guest house," he answered, closing his book and setting it carefully on a small table beside him. "You're safe here, Leo." He used my name. The sound of it in that quiet room, spoken with such calm authority, grounded me. I sank back into the cushions, the memory of the last 24 hours returning in a miserable flood. The groaning sound of the pipe in my tiny apartment, the sudden spray of icy water, the frantic call to a landlord who wouldn't answer. The slow, creeping cold as the heating failed and the water soaked through the floorboards, ruining the few possessions I actually cared about. My books, my portfolio of sketches, everything smelling of mildew and defeat. I had ended up at the town hall, which had been opened as a makeshift emergency shelter. It was chaotic and loud, full of shivering families and the smell of wet wool and instant coffee. I had found a corner, wrapped myself in a thin Red Cross blanket, and tried to disappear. That's where he had found me. Mr. Vance. He had knelt, not looming over me, but bringing himself down to my level. He'd asked me what had happened, and I'd told him, the words stumbling out, my teeth chattering too hard to speak clearly. I remembered his hand, steady and warm, on my shoulder. "That won't do," he'd said, his gaze taking in my soaked jeans and the tremor in my hands. "Come with me. I have space," I hadn't argued. I was too cold, too tired, too utterly worn down to do anything but follow him out into the swirling snow and get into his warm, quiet car that smelled, even then, of leather and something clean, like cedar. Now, in the warm guest house, shame pricked at me. I was 24 years old, a grown man, and I had let a near stranger rescue me like a stray cat. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, looking at my hands, which were still pale and chapped. You didn't have to. There was no reason for you to stay there," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "The main house has plenty of room, but I thought you might prefer the privacy here." He gestured around the space. It was a single large room, beautifully furnished, with a kitchenette in one corner and a door that I assumed led to a bathroom. It was bigger and infinitely nicer than my entire apartment. "The sofa pulls out into a bed. I'll help you with it later. For now, just rest." He stood, and his height was more apparent. He wasn't a towering man, but he had a solid, grounded build. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, nothing wasted. He walked over to the kitchenette. "I made some soup. You should eat." He didn't ask if I was hungry. He stated it as a fact, a need to be met. A few minutes later, he brought a tray over and set it on the heavy oak coffee table in front of me. A steaming bowl of what looked like chicken noodle soup, a thick slice of bread, and a glass of water. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in years. The simple, practical act of it made my throat tighten. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He just gave a slight nod and returned to his chair, picking up his book again. He didn't watch me eat. He gave me the dignity of pretending he wasn't there, allowing me to wolf down the soup without feeling scrutinized. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the last of the deep, internal chill. It was more than just the heat of the food. It was the quiet, undemanding safety of the room. The steady presence of the man across from me. For the first time in a very long time, the tight knot of anxiety in my stomach began to loosen. I was safe. He had said it, and in that moment, I believed him. I stayed in the guest house for the next 3 days, while the storm raged and then slowly subsided. My landlord finally called back, his voice full of annoyed excuses. The pipe was fixed, but the water damage was extensive. The apartment was unlivable. It would be weeks, he said, maybe a month, before the floors and walls were repaired. He offered no help, no alternative, just a problem. When I hung up the phone, the feeling of despair was so heavy it felt like I was drowning. Arthur, he had insisted I call him Arthur, found me staring out the window at the snow-laden pines that bordered his property. He didn't ask what was wrong. He seemed to know. He just stood beside me, his presence a silent inquiry. "My apartment," I said, my voice flat. "It's going to be a while." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the woods. "Then you'll stay here for a while?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same calm certainty he applied to everything. "I can't do that," I protested, turning to face him. "I can't impose. I'll find a motel or a room somewhere." Even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. My bank account was a wasteland. The library job was barely enough to cover rent and cheap groceries. A motel was a luxury I couldn't afford for more than a night or two. Arthur looked at me then, his gray eyes steady. There was no pity in them, which I was grateful for. There was just consideration. "The guest house is empty, Leo. It serves no purpose sitting vacant. You would not be an imposition. You would be a guest." He paused, as if weighing his next words. "And when you're able, you can contribute what you feel is fair for utilities. Does that seem like a reasonable arrangement?" He was giving me an out. He was reframing charity as a transaction, preserving my pride. He was turning a handout into a handshake. The thoughtfulness of it was a quiet blow. I had spent so much of my life feeling like a burden, an inconvenience to be managed. This man, this practical stranger, had seen that in me and offered me a way to feel like a participant, not a project. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. And so, my life found a new, strange rhythm. I lived in the quiet, warm guest house, a small satellite orbiting the silent planet of Arthur Vance. I still went to my job at the library, trudging down the long, cleared driveway to the main road to catch the town bus. But the evenings were different. Instead of returning to a cold, lonely box of a room, I came back to the soft glow of the lights from the guest house, a beacon in the winter dark. I started to learn him in small, observational doses. He was a man of routines. He woke early. I'd see the lights in the main house flick on before dawn as I lay in the comfortable pull-out bed. I'd watch through my window as he walked the perimeter of his property, a solitary figure in a heavy coat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He seemed to be checking on things, the old stone walls, the heavy branches of the oaks, the state of the world in his small, ordered kingdom. He worked from home. His study, on the ground floor of the main house, had a large window that faced my guest house. Sometimes, when I was reading in the evenings, I would look up and see him at his desk, a pool of lamplight illuminating his focused expression. He was a financial consultant of some kind. I'd pieced that much together from a stray piece of mail I'd brought in for him. He dealt with large, abstract numbers, with the fates of companies I'd never heard of, yet his most visible passions were small and tangible. He had a workshop in a converted barn, and on weekends, the sound of a saw or a sander would drift across the snow-covered lawn. He was restoring old furniture, bringing forgotten pieces back to life with his careful, patient hands. I watched him one Saturday from my doorway, mesmerized. He was running his palm over a newly sanded tabletop, his touch slow and assessing, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands were large and capable, with clean, short fingernails and a network of faint scars across the knuckles. They were the hands of a man who knew how to build things, how to fix what was broken. We rarely spoke at length. Our interactions were brief, anchored in necessity. He'd knock on my door to let me know another cord of firewood had been delivered for my stove. I'd leave a container of the soup I'd made on his back porch. It was a silent, careful dance of proximity without intrusion. He was giving me space, an incredible, luxurious amount of it, and I was terrified of overstepping. I found myself analyzing his every gesture, every quiet word, searching for its true meaning. When he said, "The path is icy this morning, be careful," was he just making an observation, or was he expressing a deeper, personal concern? When he left a bag of expensive, fresh ground coffee on my doorstep with a simple note that said, "Thought you might like this," was it just a kind gesture, or was it a reminder of my dependency, of all the things he could provide that I could not? My mind, accustomed to anxiety, spun these webs of doubt. But Arthur's actions were always relentlessly, frustratingly straightforward. He never hinted at obligation. He never made me feel small. The weight of his gaze was a constant, but it was a measuring, thoughtful weight, not a judgmental one. He looked at me as if I were a complex problem he was patiently trying to understand, not a mess he needed to clean up. One evening, about 2 weeks into my stay, the power went out. The whole valley was plunged into a sudden, inky blackness. My lights died, the small electric heater I used fell silent, and the only light was the faint, flickering glow from the wood stove. A moment of panic seized me. I was isolated, cut off. Then, a steady beam of light cut through the darkness from the main house. It was Arthur, walking towards me with a heavy-duty flashlight in one hand and 2 oil lamps in the other. He didn't seem remotely flustered. He stepped inside, his presence filling the small space. "Grid failure," he said, his voice calm. "Happens once or twice a winter. I have a generator for the main house, but it doesn't reach out here." He set the lamps on the table and lit them with a practiced efficiency. A warm, golden light bloomed, pushing back the shadows. It smelled of paraffin and comfort. "Thank you," I said, my heart still beating a little too fast. "You have enough wood for the night?" he asked, glancing at the basket by the stove. "Yes, I think so," he nodded. He was about to leave when he hesitated at the door. "If it gets too cold, you come to the house, Leo. Don't be proud. Just come." He left, and I was alone again in the warm, flickering light. Don't be proud. He had seen right through me, to the stubborn, foolish core of my fear. My pride was all I had left, a brittle shield against the world. And he was asking me to set it down. It was later that night, huddled under a pile of blankets and listening to the wind howl outside, that I felt the first, undeniable brush of something more than gratitude. It was a dangerous, unwelcome warmth in my chest, a yearning for the steady, quiet presence of the man in the house across the lawn. A foolish, impossible flicker of hope. I was a boy with nothing, living on the charity of a man who had everything. There was no room in that equation for anything else. I told myself that, over and over, like a prayer against temptation. But the feeling remained, a small, persistent ember in the cold, dark night. The days bled into a week, then 2. The snow began to melt, revealing the dormant brown grass of the lawn between the guest house and the main house. The world was slowly, tentatively waking up, and with it, my own anxieties began to stir anew. I couldn't stay here forever. The arrangement, as generous and respectful as Arthur had made it, was temporary. A port in a storm. But the storm inside me, the one of uncertainty and rootlessness, felt far from over. I began leaving for the library earlier and coming back later, manufacturing a busyness I didn't feel. I needed to create distance, to remind myself that my life was separate from his. It was a self-preservation instinct. The more I saw of his quiet competence, his unshakable calm, the more I felt the treacherous pull of wanting to rely on it. On him. One afternoon, I was walking up the long driveway, my worn messenger bag slung over my shoulder, when I saw him struggling with something near the barn. He was trying to maneuver a large, heavy-looking wooden crate off the back of his truck. He had a dolly, but the ground was soft and muddy from the thaw, and the wheels were sinking. He was grunting with effort, his face set in a stubborn line. For a moment, I considered just walking past, heading to the safety of my little cottage. Offering to help felt like a step across an invisible line. It was an admission that I was part of this place, not just a temporary resident. But watching him struggle, a man who was always so effortlessly in control, felt wrong. I dropped my bag on the porch and walked over. "Need a hand?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended in the quiet afternoon air. He stopped, breathing a little heavily. He looked at me, then at the crate. A flicker of something, surprise, relief, crossed his features before being replaced by his usual neutral expression. "I would appreciate it," he said. "It's heavier than it looks. An old lathe I bought at an auction. I'm stronger than I look," I replied, and was immediately rewarded with the ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was a rare, startlingly warm sight. We worked together. He directed, his instructions clear and concise. "Lift on 3. Watch your footing. Pivot toward me." We moved in tandem, a clumsy but effective team. My muscles strained, the damp chill of the air seeping into my thin jacket. But there was a satisfaction in the shared effort, in the simple, physical reality of working alongside him. We weren't benefactor and recipient. We were just two men moving a heavy object. Finally, we got the crate into the workshop. I leaned against a workbench, catching my breath, my arms aching. The workshop smelled of sawdust and oil and old wood. It was a sanctuary of purpose. Tools hung in neat rows on a pegboard, each one clean and in its place. Half-finished projects sat waiting patiently. A rocking chair with a broken runner, a chest of drawers stripped down to its bare wood. "Thank you, Leo," Arthur said. He pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped his hands. "I misjudged the mud, no problem," I said, looking around the workshop. "You do all this yourself?" "It's a hobby," he said, his gaze following mine to the rocking chair. "My grandfather taught me. He believed a man should know how to fix things with his own hands. Said it kept you grounded." He ran a hand over the smooth, curved back of the chair. I find he was right. There was a moment of comfortable silence. It was the longest we had ever spent together, the most we had ever spoken. In here, surrounded by his projects, he seemed different, less remote. The quiet, wealthy man from the big house became a man with a hobby, a man who had a grandfather who gave him practical advice. He became real. He turned back to me, his expression thoughtful. "I was a lawyer for 30 years, he said, as if it were a confession. "In the city. It was abstract. I moved paper, I argued concepts. I never built anything. I never fixed anything." He looked down at his own hands, then back at me. This is more real. It was a small window into his life, a brief, unexpected moment of vulnerability. He was telling me why he was here, why he had chosen this quiet life. He was sharing a piece of himself, and I felt the profound significance of the gesture. He didn't have to explain himself to anyone, least of all to me. "I get that," I said quietly. I thought of my own sketches, the one thing I created that felt real and solid. I like to draw. The admission felt foolishly small in the face of his tangible, useful skill. But he didn't dismiss it. His eyes lit with genuine interest. "Oh," he asked, "what do you draw?" "Mostly people. Landscapes sometimes." "Whatever I see, I'd like to see your work sometime," he said. The casual, sincere request sent a jolt of warmth through me, followed by a familiar wave of insecurity. My drawings were private, a messy, honest reflection of my own lonely world. Showing them to him would be like handing him a key to a room I kept locked. "Maybe," I said, hedging. He didn't push. He simply nodded, accepting my hesitation. "The offer stands." He then moved toward a small refrigerator in the corner of the workshop. "Can I offer you a beer? A small payment for your labor." The gentle humor in his tone eased the tension I felt. "Sure," I said. "Thanks." We sat on 2 dusty stools, drinking cold beer from long-necked bottles. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was companionable. We were 2 men, sharing a drink at the end of a task, surrounded by the quiet hum of potential in the half-finished things around us. And as I watched him take a slow sip of his beer, the firelight from that first night reflecting in my memory of his gray eyes, I felt another one of my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. The feeling in my chest was no longer a flicker. It was a slow, steady burn. The shared work in the barn shifted something between us. The carefully maintained distance seemed to shrink, not through any grand gesture, but in small, incremental ways. Our brief conversations by the woodpile, or on the path, began to stretch a little longer. He'd ask about my day at the library, not just as a pleasantry, but with a focused interest, his eyes holding mine as I spoke. I found myself telling him about the quirky patrons, the frustration of the outdated cataloging system, the small victories of finding a lost book. He listened. He actually listened, with a stillness that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't been in a very long time. One evening, he knocked on my door. He held a thick, leather-bound book in his hand. "I was sorting through some old boxes," he said. "I thought you might find this interesting." I took it from him. It was a book of anatomical sketches by a Renaissance artist, the pages thick and creamy with age. The drawings were exquisite, detailed studies of the human form. "It's beautiful," I breathed, carefully turning a page. "It belonged to my wife," he said, his voice quiet. "She was a doctor. She loved the precision of it, the intersection of art and science." It was the first time he had mentioned a wife. I looked up at him, unsure of what to say. His expression was nostalgic, not sad. "She passed away 5 years ago. This house, it was her dream. She grew up not far from here." He looked past me, toward the main house, as if seeing it through her eyes. "It was too quiet after she was gone. That's why I started the workshop. To fill the silence with the sound of making things." This was more than a window into his life. It was an open door. He was trusting me with his grief, with the memory of his love. The weight of that trust was immense. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He shook his head slightly. "It's been a long time. But the quiet remains." He looked back at me, his gaze direct. "It's been less quiet. Having you here," my breath caught in my throat. It was the closest he had ever come to saying he wanted me here. Not just tolerated me, not just housed me out of a sense of duty, but that my presence served a purpose for him, too. It balanced the scales in a way I had desperately needed. I'm glad," I managed to say. He gave me a small, sad smile, then nodded toward the book in my hands. "Keep it for as long as you like." She would have wanted it to be appreciated after he left. I sat with the book in my lap for over an hour, not even looking at the pictures. I was thinking about the man who had given it to me. A man who had loved deeply, who had known profound loss, and who was now filling his quiet life with purposeful work. He wasn't just a wealthy benefactor. He was a man who understood silence and loneliness. He was, I realized with a startling clarity, a man I was beginning to fall in love with. The realization was terrifying. It changed everything. Every glance, every brief conversation was now charged with a new, dangerous meaning. I became hyper-aware of his physical presence. The way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders when he reached for something. The sound of his steady footsteps on the gravel path. The scent of sawdust and fresh air that clung to him after he'd been in the workshop. One rainy afternoon, we were both on his covered back porch, watching the downpour. He was cleaning some garden tools, his movements methodical. I was just standing there, nursing a mug of tea, trying to work up the courage to talk to my landlord again, a task I was dreading. As he stood to put a tool away on a high shelf, his arm brushed against mine. It was nothing, a fleeting, accidental contact. But a jolt went through me, sharp and electric. I flinched away, my heart hammering against my ribs. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were searching. "Are you all right, Leo?" "Fine," I said quickly, my voice tight. Just startled me. It was a pathetic lie, and we both knew it. He didn't press. He just watched me for a long moment, his brow slightly furrowed. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. I felt exposed, as if he could see the chaotic mess of my feelings, the hopeless yearning I was trying so hard to conceal. I wanted to run, to retreat to the safety of the guest house, and lock the door. But I also wanted to stay. I wanted to close the small distance between us, to find out if the steady warmth I saw in his eyes was something I was just imagining. He was the one who broke the silence. "Leo," he began, his voice low and serious. He took a half step toward me, and my entire body tensed. "I am here. This is happening." But then his phone, which was sitting on the porch railing, began to ring, a shrill, intrusive sound that shattered the moment. He glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He picked it up, looked at the screen, and his expression hardened. He answered it, turning away from me slightly, giving me a small, apologetic look. His voice was clipped, professional. "Vance." "Yes." "No, that's unacceptable." Tell them the offer is firm, and it expires at 5 o'clock. The spell was broken. He was back in his other world, the world of business and deadlines and firm offers. The quiet man from the workshop was gone, replaced by the decisive, powerful man who commanded fortunes. The chasm between our lives yawned open again, wider than ever. I used the opportunity to escape. I should go, I mumbled, setting my mug down. Things to do. He was still on the phone, but his eyes followed me. He raised a hand, a gesture for me to wait, but I pretended not to see it. I hurried across the wet lawn, the cold rain soaking my hair, my heart a cold, heavy lump in my chest. I had been a fool to let myself feel anything. A complete and utter fool. We lived in different universes. His brief visit to my world and my extended stay in his didn't change that fundamental fact. I spent the next few days in a state of self-imposed exile. I avoided the main house, timing my departures and arrivals for when I knew Arthur would be occupied. The easy companionship we had started to build felt like a fantasy I had foolishly indulged. The reality was the phone call on the porch, a stark reminder of the man he was and the boy I was. My landlord called with an update that only deepened my sense of displacement. The repairs were stalled. There was an issue with the insurance, a dispute over the extent of the damage. Could be another month, he'd said, his voice devoid of sympathy. Maybe longer. The words landed like a death sentence to my fragile independence. Another month. Living here, in this limbo, under Arthur's roof, felt untenable. The kindness that had once felt like a lifeline now felt like a chain, each link forged from my own inadequacy. I had to leave. I didn't know where I would go or what I would do, but the thought of staying, of continuing this charade, was suffocating. My resolve hardened when I ran into Martha, one of the more gossipy librarians at the grocery store in town. She gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and sharp curiosity. "Leo, I heard about your apartment, you poor thing. But I hear you landed on your feet. Staying with Mr. Vance, aren't you?" Her tone was laced with insinuation, her eyes darting over my basket of cheap pasta and canned sauce. He's always been such a generous man, especially to those in need. The heat rose in my cheeks. I knew what she was implying. I was the town charity case, the young, helpless thing taken in by the wealthy, solitary man on the hill. The narrative was as old and ugly as time. It didn't matter that Arthur had been nothing but respectful. The optics, as they say, were terrible. And in a small town, optics were reality. I wasn't just compromising my own dignity. I was inviting speculation about his. That was the tipping point. I couldn't allow his kindness to be twisted into something sordid. I couldn't be the cause of whispers that would tarnish his reputation in the town he had chosen as his home. That evening, I saw him in the garden that ran along the side of the main house. The first crocuses were pushing through the damp earth, small, defiant splashes of purple and yellow. He was kneeling, carefully clearing away the last of the dead winter leaves from around them, his movements gentle and precise. "This is it." I took a deep breath and walked towards him, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm against my ribs. He heard my approach and looked up, his expression brightening slightly when he saw me. The genuine warmth in his greeting was a knife in my gut. "Leo, I haven't seen much of you the last few days," he said, his voice mild, but with an undercurrent of question. "I've been busy," I lied. "Arthur, I need to talk to you." He seemed to sense the gravity in my tone. He got to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees. He gave me his full attention, his gray eyes patient and waiting. "I can't stay here anymore," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could lose my nerve. "My apartment isn't going to be ready for a while, and it's not right for me to keep imposing on you. I'm so grateful for everything, more than I can say, but I have to go." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. "Did someone say something to you?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The question was so direct, so perceptive, it threw me off. "No," I said too quickly. "It's not that. I can't." "Look at me, Leo," he said, and his tone was so firm, so commanding, that I had no choice but to obey. I met his eyes. "Tell me the truth." The weight of his gaze was immense. It was a gaze that demanded honesty, that stripped away pretense. I couldn't lie to him. "People are talking," I admitted, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "They're saying things. About you. About me. About why I'm here, a muscle tightened in his jaw. And what other people say matters more to you than your own well-being. It matters when it affects you. I retorted, a surge of desperate energy rising in me. You've been kind to me, and in return, I'm making you the subject of small-town gossip. It isn't fair. I am a grown man, Leo, he said, his voice sharp with an emotion I couldn't quite place. I am perfectly capable of managing my own reputation. I care very little for what Martha at the library thinks. He knew. Of course, he knew. He saw everything. The only thing I care about right now is the real reason you want to leave. This isn't about gossip. Not entirely. He took a step closer. The air crackled between us. This is about what happened on the porch the other day, isn't it? The loaded question hung in the air. He was confronting it. He was refusing to let me hide. My carefully constructed walls were being dismantled, brick by brick, by his relentless, gentle honesty. I don't know what you mean, I stammered. Don't you? He said, his voice softening now. He was only a few feet from me. I could smell the damp earth on his clothes, the faint, clean scent of his skin. Leo, I am not a difficult man to read, but I am also not a fool. I have seen the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. And I have felt a tension between us. A potential. I have also seen how it frightens you. He was laying it all bare. All the things I had been so terrified of, so desperate to conceal. He saw it all. So, I will ask you a simple question, he continued, his eyes holding mine captive. And I want a simple, honest answer. Do you want to leave? Or do you feel you have to leave? The world seemed to shrink to the space between us. The sounds of the evening, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of the wind in the pines, faded away. There was only his question and the profound, terrifying choice it represented. I could lie. I could retreat into the safety of my pride and my fear. Or I could, for the first time in my adult life, be completely, ruinously honest. My throat was dry. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet air. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I looked at his face, at the patient lines around his eyes, at the firm, steady set of his mouth. And I saw not a benefactor, not a wealthy man, but just a man. A man who was offering me a truth I was too scared to claim. I don't want to leave, I whispered, the admission torn from the deepest part of me. It felt like a surrender. It felt like a victory. The confession hung in the air, fragile and immense. Arthur's expression didn't change, but a subtle tension I hadn't even noticed in his shoulders seemed to dissolve. He had been waiting for that answer, I realized. He had been holding his own breath. But I'm scared, I added, the rest of the truth tumbling out now that the dam was broken. Arthur, look at us. You have this life. This beautiful, solid, real life. And I have nothing. I'm a mess. I'm living in your guest house because my apartment flooded and I have no money. People are right to talk. It looks exactly like what they think it is. What you have or don't have is circumstance, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in my sea of panic. It is not who you are. I know who you are, Leo. I've been watching you. He took another step, closing the remaining distance between us. He was so close now I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I see a man who is kind, who is resilient. A man who works hard at a job that doesn't value him. I see an artist who is afraid to show his work. I see a profound goodness in you, and a profound loneliness that I recognize all too well. His words wrapped around me, a balm on wounds I didn't even know were still open. He wasn't seeing the charity case. He was seeing me. He raised a hand, slowly, giving me every chance to pull away. He cupped my cheek, his palm warm and slightly rough against my skin. His thumb stroked gently just below my eye. The touch was electric, a current of pure, unadulterated feeling that shot through my entire body. I leaned into his hand, my eyes fluttering shut. All the fight went out of me, replaced by a wave of bone-deep yearning. I am not a boy, Leo, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion that mirrored my own. I know what I want. And what other people think has never been a consideration for me in matters of importance. He paused, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. And this, he said, his voice dropping even lower, feels important. I am here. This is real. The thought is no longer a panic, but a steadying presence. This is happening. I open my eyes. His face is inches from mine. His gray eyes are dark with an intensity one have never seen before, a raw, undisguised desire that makes my breath hitch. He is giving me the choice. His gaze is a question. His hand on my face is a statement. But he is waiting. He is letting me have the final say, the ultimate control. In this moment, the power dynamic that has haunted me is gone. We are two people, standing on the precipice of something terrifying and beautiful. I gave him my answer without a word. I leaned forward, closing that final, infinitesimal gap between us. The first touch of his lips was tentative, soft, a question. My response was a quiet sigh of surrender, of relief. The kiss deepened, and it was nothing like I had imagined. It wasn't frantic or desperate. It was slow and sure and deep. It was a conversation we had been having for weeks, finally spoken in a language we both understood. It tasted of the cool evening air and a profound, grounding certainty. It felt like coming home to a place I had never been before. His other hand came up to my waist, pulling me gently against him. I could feel the solid strength of his chest, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against my own frantic pulse. My hands, of their own accord, found their way to his shoulders, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He didn't let me go. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel his breath on my lips, warm and steady. "Leo," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. It was all he said. It was all he needed to say. My name, on his lips, was a promise. It was an acceptance. It was the beginning of everything. We stood there for a long time in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the scent of damp earth and new spring growth, holding on to each other as if we were the only two people in the world. The gossip, the fear, the differences between our lives, it all faded into an insignificant hum. The only thing that was real was the solid warmth of his body against mine and the undeniable, earth-shattering truth of his hand, still holding my face as if I were something precious, something worth protecting, something worth wanting. I woke the next morning in my own bed in the guest house, the pale dawn light filtering through the windows. For a disoriented moment, I thought it might have been a dream, a vivid, desperate fantasy spun from loneliness and gratitude. But then I rolled over, and the scent of him, that clean, cedar and sawdust scent, was on my pillow. My own clothes were folded neatly on the chair where I'd left them in a heap. He must have carried them over from the main house after I'd fallen asleep on his sofa. The memory came back in a warm, hazy rush. After the kiss, he had led me by the hand into the main house. We hadn't spoken much. There were no grand declarations. Instead, he had made me a cup of tea, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever, though I saw a slight tremor in his hand as he passed me the mug. We sat by his fireplace, not on opposite sides of the room as before, but together on the large, comfortable sofa. He had kept an arm around me, a solid, reassuring weight. I had talked, really talked, for the first time. I told him about my parents, who had died when I was in college, about the string of dead-end jobs, about my dream of being a real artist that felt more distant every year. He had just listened, his thumb rubbing slow, soothing circles on my arm. I had felt safe enough to be vulnerable, and I had eventually drifted off to sleep, my head on his shoulder. Now, in the stark morning light, a familiar chill of anxiety crept in. The night had been perfect, a moment of pure emotional honesty. But morning brought with it the cold, hard light of reality. What now? What were we? The immense, complicated gulf between our lives hadn't magically disappeared with a kiss. If anything, it was now more fraught with peril. Before, I was a temporary guest. Now what was I? The fear of dependency, of being seen as a kept boy, came rushing back with a vengeance. I had given in to my feelings, and in doing so, had I just made myself more pathetic, more beholden to him? I got out of bed, my stomach churning. I had to get a grip. I had to find a way to stand on my own 2 feet, now more than ever. As if summoned by my anxiety, there was a soft knock on the door. I pulled on a t-shirt and jeans, my heart thudding, and opened it. Arthur was standing there, holding 2 coffee mugs. He was dressed in his usual weekend attire of a soft flannel shirt and worn jeans. He looked solid, real, and impossibly calm. He gave me a small, gentle smile. The lines around his eyes crinkled. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding out one of the mugs. I took it, my fingers brushing against his. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my cold hands. "Thank you, may I come in?" he asked. I stepped back, and he entered, his presence immediately making the small cottage feel warmer, safer. He didn't crowd me. He just went to the small table by the window and set his own mug down. He looked at me, his expression serious but kind. "Leo, we should talk," he said. My stomach plummeted. This was it. The morning after regret. The careful explanation of how this was a mistake. But his next words were not what I expected. "I want to be very clear, so there are no misunderstandings between us," he began, his voice steady. "What happened last night was something I have wanted for some time. It was not a moment of impulse, and it is not something I regret. The relief that washed over me was so intense it made me dizzy. However," he continued, and my anxiety spiked again, "I am also acutely aware of your situation. The last thing I ever want is for you to feel trapped or obligated or dependent on me. Your independence and your dignity are paramount to me and for us, if there is to be an us." He was addressing my deepest fears head-on, without my even having to voice them. The man's perception was almost terrifying. "So, I have a proposal," he said. "It is practical. It may seem unromantic, but I believe it is necessary." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You continue to stay here, in the guest house. I want you here. But we will draw up a formal lease agreement. The rent will be nominal, something you can easily afford on your salary, just enough to make it official. It will be your space, your home. You will not be my guest. You will be my tenant." And, he added, a slight warmth entering his eyes, "my neighbor." I stared at him, speechless. He was building a boundary, a formal structure, not to push me away, but to give me a foundation to stand on. He was using his resources not to control me, but to empower me. It was the most profoundly romantic and respectful gesture I could possibly imagine. "And as for us," he went on, a faint hint of color rising in his cheeks, "we will be two neighbors who are getting to know one another. We will go on dates. We will have dinner. We will take things at a pace that feels comfortable for you. Nothing is assumed. Everything is a choice. Your choice." He had thought it all through. He had anticipated my fears, my pride, my insecurity, and he had built a bridge across them made of respect and practical care. He wasn't just offering me his heart. He was offering me my own autonomy. Tears pricked my eyes. I blinked them back, furiously. "Okay," I said, my voice thick. "Yes. Okay." He seemed to understand that I couldn't say more. He reached out, not to pull me into an embrace, but just to lay his hand on my arm. His touch was warm, firm, and reassuring. A silent confirmation. "Good," he said softly. "Now drink your coffee before it gets cold." The following week was both strange and wonderful. True to his word, Arthur had a simple, fair lease agreement drawn up. Signing it felt like a monumental act, a declaration of my own agency. I was no longer a castaway. I was a resident. I had a home. We started to court each other, in a quiet, old-fashioned way. One night, he formally invited me to the main house for dinner. He cooked a simple, delicious roast chicken, and we ate at his large dining room table, the space feeling less intimidating and more like a place where meals were meant to be shared. We talked for hours. He told me about his cases as a lawyer, the ones he was proud of, where he had fought for the underdog. I, in turn, found myself pulling out my sketchbook and showing him my drawings. He looked at each one with a focused, serious intensity, his comments astute and encouraging. He didn't flatter me. He engaged with my work, seeing things in it that even I hadn't consciously realized. A few days later, it was my turn. I cooked spaghetti in my little kitchenette, the only thing I knew how to make well, and he came over to the guest house. He sat at my small table, his large frame making the space feel cozy rather than cramped. He didn't seem to notice or care that my plates didn't match or that I only had one good wine glass. He just seemed happy to be there, with me. The public test came the following Saturday. We needed groceries, and we decided to go into town together. Walking into the store with him felt like a declaration. I was braced for stares, for whispers. I saw Martha by the checkout lanes, and my stomach clenched. She saw us. Her eyes widened, and she immediately turned to whisper to the woman next to her. I felt a familiar urge to shrink, to pull away. But then I felt Arthur's hand, warm and firm, on the small of my back. It wasn't a possessive gesture. It was a gesture of solidarity, of quiet, unshakable support. "I am here with you. We are together." I straightened my shoulders and met Martha's curious gaze with a small, polite smile. I did not look away. Arthur gave no sign he had even noticed her, His attention focused on the list in his hand. "Do we need olive oil?" he asked me, his voice normal, calm, as if we were any other couple doing their weekend shopping. In that small, mundane moment, I felt a profound shift. Her gossip, her judgment, it had no power over me. It couldn't touch what was real between us. Bolstered by his steady presence, I felt my own strength return. We were not a secret. We were not something to be ashamed of. We were just two people buying groceries. And it was enough. We finished our shopping, and as we walked out into the bright spring sunshine, Arthur's hand slid from my back down to my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. It was a simple, public claim, offered without fanfare. I curled my fingers around his, my heart swelling with a feeling so pure and strong it almost hurt. I was no longer just surviving. I was beginning to live. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both brand new and deeply comfortable. The lease agreement, that practical, unromantic document, became the quiet foundation upon which we built everything else. It was the constant, unspoken reassurance that I was in his life by choice, not by circumstance. It allowed me to breathe, to relax, to accept his kindness not as charity, but as the affection of a partner. With that security, other parts of my life began to shift. The constant, grinding anxiety that had been my companion for so long began to recede. I started sleeping through the night. I found myself sketching more, not just furtive drawings in a hidden book, but larger pieces spread out on the table in the guest house. The fear of failure, the certainty that my art was pointless, began to seem less like a fact and more like a bad habit. Arthur was the catalyst for that change, not through grand gestures, but through his quiet, steady belief in me. He framed one of my charcoal sketches of the woods behind his house and hung it in his study. Seeing it there, on his wall, treated as real art, did more for my confidence than 1,000 words of praise could have. We created our own routines, weaving our two separate lives together. Most mornings, he would bring coffee over to the guest house, and we'd sit at my small table, watching the sun rise over the valley. In the evenings, I would often go to the main house. Sometimes we would cook dinner together, moving around his large, well-equipped kitchen in an easy, companionable dance. Other times, we would simply read in the same room, him in his leather armchair by the fire, me curled on the sofa, the comfortable silence a testament to the depth of our connection. We didn't need to fill the space with noise. Just being together was enough. We were learning each other's language. I learned that his gruffness was a shield for a deep, protective tenderness. I learned that his silence was thoughtful, not dismissive. He, in turn, learned to read my moods, to know when my quietness was contentment and when it was the shadow of old anxieties creeping back. He learned how to coax me out of my shell with a gentle question or a simple, grounding touch. One cool evening, we were sitting on the porch of the main house, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars come out. The air was crisp and clean. "I've been thinking," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "About your work." I tensed slightly. "The library?" "No," he said. "Your real work. Your art." He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "You have a gift, Leo. It's a waste for you to be spending 40 hours a week shelving books when you could be creating. It pays the bills," I said, the old, practical fear resurfacing. "Art doesn't." "I want to make you another proposal," he said, anticipating my objection. "And like the last one, it is practical. There is a small community college in the next town over. They have an excellent arts program. I want to pay for you to take classes. Not as a gift," he added quickly, seeing the protest forming on my lips. "As an investment. I'll be your patron. You can pay me back when you're a rich and famous artist. Or, you can pay me back by creating beautiful things that I can hang on my walls." The terms are negotiable. The offer was breathtaking. It was a chance, a real chance, to pursue the one thing I had always loved. But the old fears were strong. "Arthur, I can't let you do that. It's too much." "Why?" he asked simply. "Why is it too much for me to want to invest in the happiness of the person I care about? I have the resources, Leo. They are meaningless if they can't be used to create something good in the world. And helping you find your voice as an artist, that feels like a very good thing." He reached over and took my hand, his grip firm. "Let me do this. Not for you. For us." I looked into his eyes, and I saw no pity, no desire for control. I saw only a man who believed in me, who wanted to see me fly. And I realized my pride, my stubborn refusal to accept help, was no longer a shield. It was a cage, and he was offering me the key. Okay, I whispered. Okay, the next chapter of my life began. I enrolled in 2 classes at the college, life drawing and oil painting. I quit my job at the library, a move that was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time, my days were my own, filled with the smell of charcoal and turpentine, with the challenge of translating the world onto a blank canvas. It was hard. I was rusty, and my classmates were younger, more confident. There were days of frustration, when nothing seemed to work, when I felt like an imposter. But Arthur was my rock. He never asked to see my work unless I offered. He never questioned my process. He just made sure there was a hot meal waiting for me when I got home, and a quiet space for me to work. His belief in me was a silent, constant presence that gave me the courage to keep going, to push through the doubt. One afternoon, he came into the guest house, which I had officially converted into a studio. I was working on a portrait, a large canvas. He stood behind me, watching for a while in silence. "It's good," he said finally, his voice quiet. "It's not right yet," I said, frowning at the canvas. "The eyes are wrong. They're not steady enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Who is it?" I turned to look at him, a half smile on my face. "Who do you think?" It was him. A portrait of him, sitting in his armchair by the fire, a book in his lap. I had been working on it for weeks, trying to capture not just his likeness, but his essence. The quiet strength, the thoughtful intelligence, the subtle kindness in the set of his mouth. I had been trying to capture the man I loved. He stepped forward and looked at the painting, truly looked at it. His expression was one of quiet wonder. He reached out, as if to touch the canvas, then stopped himself. "This is how you see me?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "It's how I'm trying to," I said. "I told you, the eyes aren't right yet." He turned to me, and the look in his own eyes was so full of love, so unguarded and open, it took my breath away. "They're perfect," he said softly. He closed the space between us and kissed me, a deep, lingering kiss full of a gratitude and love that went beyond words. In that moment, standing in my small studio, surrounded by the smell of paint and the evidence of my own hard work, I felt a sense of rightness, of belonging, that was absolute. I was no longer the boy he had rescued from the cold, and he was no longer just my protector. We were partners. He had given me a safe harbor, yes, but he had also given me a map and the tools to navigate my own sea. The difference in our ages, in our bank accounts, had become what it always should have been, mere context, not the story itself. The story was about 2 lonely people who had found each other in the quiet of a winter storm and built a new life together, a life filled with art and purpose, and a steady, abiding warmth that kept the cold at bay. It was a life that felt like home. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.